Perhaps before we go into this question, into this theme, it would be good to have some kind of basic understanding of what this process really all about, and also to elaborate a little bit on what did Sri Aurobindo meant by all that elaborate quote that you brought up. First of all, the important thing is for you to have a clear understanding of what that energy, that rising energy is, based on your cultural, let's say, heritage, even on the level of your DNA. Why? Because unless you have that clear understanding of this, there will always be a chance that you will view this in terms of some kind of esoteric, overly intellectualized and somewhat foreign to your own culture phenomena, which in fact it is not. As long as we all share human body, and we'll speak about it later on, about the differences between the female and the male, we all share the same anatomy and the processes that govern within this physiology. Just like there is this physiology, there is this subtle physiology which governs this gross body from a different plane altogether. And that what is known as Kundalini should have a very clear cultural context of how that is in your own, let's say, background. And if your background, let's say, comes from Christian, somewhat, religious background that links your both mom and dad, then in Christianity, this energy could be viewed either as a Holy Spirit, which governs all these processes in the body, right, as one of the Trinity, or it could be even viewed as in the terms of the esoteric symbol or meaning of the Mother of the Christ. So it's the Divine Mother herself. Whether Christ lived in real life or not is besides the point. There is this archetypal imagery, this archetypal figure of Christ, which stands for the supreme consciousness, the Christ consciousness, which is equal to the highest consciousness embodied in a human life as love. So that Kundalini, you see, is the mother that gives birth to Christ himself. So this is just to give you that very different perspective of what this energy really is. And when we say energy, of course we're using and getting away with the limitations of the language, because when we refer to Shakti or Kundalini, it is not just energy. It's that which gives birth to energy. This is a very important distinction. So this as a preface, let's say, this is as a prelude, should give you an idea that it is not a methodology of some kind of cultural preference for spiritual advancement, but in fact, the only real transformational process, regardless of any cultural or otherwise orientation. So, and this is why when we hear of many various awakenings, of people awaken, and people experience these sudden revelations, or like thrown in the midst of the spiritual emergency, there is a certain pattern there, pattern that can be classified, systematically observed, and categorized even. And these patterns give us a possibility to see that there is something profoundly unifying, even though unique to each and every one, And that unification, that, let's say, possibility of giving a synthesizing approach or synthesizing overview allows us to speak about it in the first place, as we're doing it now. So with regard to the, let's say, what you've experienced and what you, let's say, read about this whole business of self-realization, viewed from the energetic perspective, what Sri Aurobindo was describing is what I called the descent of grace. What is known in the tradition from which I speak is a descent of grace. And in my observations, including my own direct experience, is that the initial rising was triggered and often initiated by that initial descent of grace. So it is the grace that really that opens up that process, which can then unfold in, let's say, as gracefully and as graceful manner as it would. But without that initial, as let's say, descent, without that initial downward movement, the proper ascent, in my view, is almost impossible. Not that it is entirely impossible, but it will always be accompanied by complications of various sorts. And it is a theme in itself, a vast theme in itself, because rising is not just that rising which we kind of populistically know, that Kundalini enters the medium channel, the Sushumna, and then it rises to the top of the head, to the higher chakras, to the Sahasrara or to the Brahmarandra, as it is called in some other traditions, and issues that state of oneness with the Godhead. No, even the Sushumna channel, if viewed properly from the science of Kundalini, it's not just some kind of like a tube, no matter how subtle that tube is when we speak about it. But it actually contains of internal layers, progressively subtle layers. It's like, imagine the shaft, which have subtler shafts within. So the tradition speaks of 6 various possible risings. And it is a theme on its own, and we're not going to speak about it. I advise you to really, let's say, make steps towards your own investigations, because this is a fascinating theme. But from your question, it seems to me whether you validate your own experience of that descent of energy with the consequent ascent. So there are possibilities that that initial activation, that initial, let's say, Shakti part, or the descent of grace, or whatever that grace that came from let's say, a worship deity, a guru teacher, preceptor, or it could come from the much more rarefied planes. It could come from, let's say, a being of light who is not necessarily in a physical body. It could be initiated in a waking state or in a dreaming state of consciousness. And that initial, let's say, transmission, that initial transmission of grace is not necessarily immediately accompanied by the rising as we know it. In order for that consciousness to rise, and Kundalini is individualized consciousness that is actually the architect of your body, architect of your individuality. So that, let's say, rising depends on many, many factors. It depends above all else on the state of your subtle body and the nervous system, because they are intimately interconnected. Because nervous system is that system which literally connects the subtle body with the gross body. So the rising, if it's not immediately experienced on the downward movement of grace, does not mean that someone has experienced a full realization and there is no necessity for rising. No. Rising is like consciousness has to transgress all psychic centers, known as chakras, in order for true purification to take place, because the subtle body, or the astral body, is that body which is made of frequencies of light and sound, which is the conglomerate of the psychic centers. All the information about your being is stored and recorded like a software within that body. So in order for that rising to really ensue, there have to be a groundwork. The subtle body has to be actually able to withstand that process. It has to be prepared somewhat. Otherwise, rising can be experienced as no rising. There was this initial, let's say, awakening, initial sensations, feelings, whatever, spiritual experiences, but it is not accompanied by a distinctive, let's say, experience of rising, simply because it's not rising at all. Kundalini cannot release from its seat in Muladhara simply because there is not enough network within to support that process. That is number one scenario. B and C and D and what have you, there are many, many other scenarios why that process is not unfolding. Still worse is when that rising is actually entering the wrong channels. And as I said earlier, there are different pathways to God. And not all of them necessarily lead to God, or does not lead to God directly. There are a lot of detours and cul-de-sacs on the road. So this need to be accounted for. It's a science, it's a profound science. So this is just a brief response to your question. Yes, ascend and descend of Shakti, or let's say descend of grace and ascend of that energy as Shakti, are intimately interconnected, very often accompanied by each other. Very often these two are in fact one process. But how do we experience it? It's all boils down to the way our subtle body is developed, to the way our subtle body can function and can really be the road to that process. Now, a few words in relation to the differences in female and male physiology, of which some have been speaking about and bringing it up as that it's so vastly different that one cannot even begin to compare. To a degree, however, the difference really, well, some people bring this example that even the pulse in the female Ayurvedically being checked on the left hand and in the male on the right hand and what have you. Yes, but we're dealing on the level of the doshas and on the level of the gross body. When we speak of the spiritual anatomy of the subtle body of men and women differ very, very little. With one main difference is that actually female body is more equipped with containing more prana. Hence, it is better equipped for that process. It is, as it were, better designed to withstand that process. I'm not going to go into the very specifics of differences, but I want to say that we are actually different only down on the level of the elemental order. But if we speak of the progressive, let's say, unfoldment and rising, there comes a point when the tattvas the gross tattvas have been transgressed, and Kundalini passes the threshold and enters the place of Sadashiva, the place of the, let's say, the cortexes in the brain associated with Ajna chakra. There is no female or male there. The polarities merge there. It goes beyond the confluence. It returns to that primal state where the differentiation between the sexes is simply irrelevant to talk about. Hence, yes, there are some differences, and as I said earlier, females are often in advantage with this process of energetic transformation because their body are capable of carrying and storing more prana. which is very, very important. Hence the subtle body is capable of withholding that process, because that's where the prana is mainly stored. What is subtle body? Subtle body contains of the pranic sheet, mental sheet, and the sheet of discrimination, the so-called pranamaya kosha, manomaya kosha, and vijnanamaya kosha. These three layers, like in the Russian doll, of which I spoke a lot about, is what comprises and makes the subtle body. So, how relevant it is to speak of the vast difference between male and female process, I don't know. In my experience, and my experience is based on roughly, for every 10 people that I've worked with, 7 of them were females. So my experience of working with awakened sadhakas, with awakened spiritual aspirants, is more based on actually dealing with female than with male contingency. I hope this somehow clarifies a little bit on the topic that you brought up. And not to discourage in any way, but I would say that I would actually encourage you to go and find out what really happens, but not in the format of Facebook or YouTube, but in a direct manner. You have to approach an adept and bring this question forth in order to receive a satisfying answer, so that you understand what really happened to you, and also to have that reassurance of what is actually in the process, because not everything culminates in the Satchitananda and the bliss of the self. A lot of these pathways are hidden by pitfalls and, dare I say, places where you can be stuck for many, many months, if not years. So it's better to actually have that courage to present yourself to someone with whom you feel affinity, resonance, and your intuition backs it up, and go for it in order to facilitate further unfoldment, because this process goes from here, it goes into infinity. Jai Gurudev.